The puppy had stopped crying on the fourth day. Not because the pain was gone, but because he had learned that crying did nothing, that the sound of his own voice bouncing off the crumpled metal and coming back unchanged meant no one was close enough to hear it. He was 4 months old. His ribs showed through fur that had once been glossy black and tan, and was now matted with mud and engine fluid, and something darker that had dried along his left side. He lay curled against the driver's side door of a silver Subaru that had left the road 8 days ago and come to rest 40 feet down a ravine in a stand of lodgepole pine so thick that the wreck was invisible from the highway above. The door was caved inward. The windshield was a web of frost and fracture. And inside the car, buckled into the driver's seat with her head against the deployed airbag, a 71-year-old woman had not moved in a very long time. The puppy pressed himself closer to the door. He had not left. 8 days. He had not left. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay until the very end, because what a Navy SEAL and his K9 discovered at the bottom of that ravine changed more than one life. We read every single comment. Chief Petty Officer Nathan Cole, United States Navy, retired, had not planned to be on Highway 93 that morning. He had planned to spend the day repairing a section of fence on the north pasture of the 40-acre property he'd bought outside Eureka, Montana, 14 months ago. A property that was more project than home, more silence than shelter, and exactly what he had needed after 17 years in naval special warfare, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being very good at something the rest of the world prefers not to think about. He was 40 years old and built with a kind of density that doesn't come from gyms, but from years of carrying heavy things across difficult terrain in places where putting them down was not an option. He stood just under 6 feet with wide squared shoulders and forearms roped with tendon and vein, and his hands were the hands of someone who had used them for precise and serious work in environments that did not forgive imprecision. His hair was dark, cut short, going gray above the ears in a way he had stopped noticing. His jaw was heavy and clean-shaved. His nose had been broken once, in a breaching operation in Ramadi in 2008, and it had set with a slight rightward cant that gave his face an asymmetry people read, without quite understanding why, as experience rather than damage. His eyes were pale green, not bright, not striking, but still in a way that made people careful about what they said next. They were the eyes of someone who had spent years making decisions in fractions of seconds, and had learned that the quality of the looking mattered more than the speed of the acting. He did not scan rooms the way some veterans do. Restlessly, compulsively, he simply saw everything. And what he saw, he remembered. He had completed 3 deployments with DevGru, 2 in Afghanistan's Paktia and Kunar provinces, and 1 in northern Iraq during the final phase of a campaign he would never name in conversation, and had signed documents agreeing to forget. He had earned a Silver Star for an extraction under fire in the Shock Valley that had cost him 2 teammates, and a Bronze Star with Valor for a night operation in Mosul that had cost him the hearing in his left ear and 3 months in a hospital in Landstuhl. He had been medically retired after his 3rd deployment, when the accumulated damage to his left knee, shrapnel, stress fractures, and 1 high-altitude jump that had ended wrong made it clear that the body had finished what the mind was not yet willing to stop. He had driven west from Virginia Beach with no particular destination, and had stopped in Eureka because the mountains reminded him of country he'd operated in, and because the realtor hadn't asked questions, and because 40 acres of broken fence and overgrown pasture felt like a problem he could solve without anyone dying. He was not at peace. He was adjacent to it. He had Titan, and most days that was enough. Titan was a 7-year-old German Shepherd, 84 pounds, with a deep black saddle coat, that darkened almost to charcoal along his spine and ears, and lightened to a rich amber gold across his chest and legs. His fur was dense and coarse, the kind of coat bred for mountain work, for cold, for the particular demands of a dog who had spent 4 years operating in terrain where warmth was a memory and endurance was a requirement. His left canine was titanium, a replacement for the tooth he'd lost biting through a door panel during a compound entry in Kunar province that had saved the life of the operator behind him. The replacement caught the light when he panted, a small flash of metal that people noticed and that Titan seemed, in the particular way of dogs who know their own history, quietly proud of. He moved with the deliberate economy of an animal who had been trained to conserve energy between bursts of total commitment. No wasted steps, no idle movement. Every shift in weight, a calculation. His ears rotated constantly, independently, picking up frequencies and directional information that Nathan had long ago stopped trying to match. He rode in the passenger seat of Nathan's truck with his head slightly raised and his eyes fixed on the road ahead. And when something changed, a sound, a scent, a shift in pressure that human senses couldn't register, his entire body communicated it before his mouth opened. Nathan had spent 8 months and a congressional inquiry getting Titan released from the military working dog program after his retirement. He did not regret a single phone call. Titan was the only partner he had ever had who had never required an explanation for silence, and in the 14 months since they'd come to Montana, the dog had become the fixed point around which Nathan had slowly, carefully, begun to rebuild something he was not yet ready to call a life. The morning of November 9th was cold in the way that Montana gets cold before the first real snow. Not the dramatic, wind-driven cold of a blizzard, but the still, settled cold that sinks into the ground and the trees and the metal of a truck's door handle and waits. The sky was a flat pewter gray that sat low on the mountains and promised snow by evening. The air smelled like pine resin and frozen earth and the particular mineral sharpness of a season turning. Nathan had driven into Eureka for lumber and was heading back north on 93 when Titan lifted his head from the seat and went rigid. Not alert. Rigid, ears locked forward, nostrils flaring in quick, shallow pulls. His body vibrating with a frequency that Nathan had seen exactly twice before in the field. Both times before Titan had located a person buried under rubble. Nathan slowed the truck. He watched the dog. Titan's head tracked to the right, toward the tree line on the east side of the highway, and held. His breath fogged the passenger window in short, rapid bursts. He whined once, not a complaint, a report. Nathan pulled over. He sat for a moment with the engine idling, watching Titan, reading the dog the way he'd been trained to read him, not as an animal exhibiting behavior, but as a sensor array delivering data. The data said, "Someone is down there." He got out. The cold hit him immediately, sharp and clean. The shoulder of the highway was gravel and frozen mud, and beyond it the ground dropped away steeply into a ravine choked with pine and deadfall. He couldn't see anything from the road. Nobody could. That was the point. That was why, 8 days earlier, when Margaret Hollis had failed to arrive at her daughter's house in Kalispell, and her daughter had called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Department, the deputies who had driven Highway 93 looking for her car had seen nothing and reported nothing, and closed the search after 48 hours with a notation that read, "Vehicle not located on reported route. Subject may have taken alternate highway. Case reclassified. Voluntary missing adult." Sheriff Dale Whitfield had signed off on that reclassification personally. He was 57 years old, 3 years from a pension, and he ran his department the way a man runs a department when he has stopped caring about outcomes and started caring about paperwork. He had 19 deputies covering 4,000 square miles of mountain and forest and highway, and he had told Margaret's daughter Claire that search and rescue operations required evidence of distress, and that a 71-year-old woman who was 3 hours late to a family dinner did not constitute evidence of distress. He had told Claire this in a voice that suggested she was wasting his time. He had not sent a single deputy to walk the shoulder of 93 and look for tire marks or broken guardrail reflectors or any of the small, specific signs that a car had left the road. He had not requested a helicopter. He had not contacted Montana Highway Patrol. He had closed the case because closing cases was easier than working them, and because Margaret Hollis was an elderly woman who lived alone. And elderly women who lived alone sometimes drove to places that were not where they said they would be, and in Dale Whitfield's experience, they usually turned up. Margaret had not turned up. Her daughter had called every day. Dale had returned none of the calls. Nathan didn't know any of this yet. He knew only that Titan was pulling toward the tree line with a controlled intensity that meant life, not death. The dog could distinguish the two, and his behavior now was the behavior that preceded a living find. He leashed Titan and started down the slope. The ground was loose shale and pine needles frozen into a surface that gave way under his boots in unpredictable slides. He moved carefully, one hand on the leash, one hand bracing against tree trunks, following Titan's lead because in terrain like this the dog's judgment was better than his, and he had learned long ago, in mountains far worse than these, that trusting the dog was not sentiment, it was survival. Halfway down, Titan stopped and looked back at him, with an expression Nathan had seen only in the field, an expression that was not urgency, but certainty. The calm, absolute focus of a dog who has located what he was looking for and is now simply waiting for his handler to arrive at the same conclusion. Nathan felt something tighten in his chest. He'd felt it once before, in a collapsed building outside Jalalabad, the moment Titan had led him to a doorway beneath which a young girl was still breathing under 4 feet of rubble. The feeling was not hope. It was the thing that comes just before hope, when the body understands what the mind has not yet accepted. They found the car at the bottom. It had rolled once and come to rest against a cluster of pines, driver's side down, the roof buckled but intact. The silver paint was already dulling under a week's worth of frost and pine sap. The smell hit Nathan before the sight registered fully. Oil, coolant, and beneath it something organic and unmistakable that he had encountered in buildings in Iraq and Afghanistan, and had hoped, in the quiet private corners of his mind, to never encounter again. Then he saw the puppy. He was lying against the driver's side door, wedged into a hollow between the car's frame and the frozen ground, and when he saw Titan coming down the slope he lifted his head and made a sound that was not a bark and not a whine, but something between the two, the particular vocalization of a very young animal who has been alone long enough to forget what company sounds like and is remembering it all at once. Titan stopped. He lowered his head. He approached the puppy slowly, with the exaggerated care of a large dog communicating to a small one that he is not a threat. The puppy pressed himself flat against the ground and trembled. Titan lay down beside him, close enough to touch, and stayed. Nathan approached the car. He looked through the shattered rear window. Margaret Hollis was in the driver's seat, her body held upright by the seatbelt, her head resting against what remained of the airbag. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was the color of candle wax. On the passenger seat beside her was an open bag of dog food, a small bag, the kind you buy for a puppy, and a red leash still in its packaging. She had been bringing the puppy to her daughter. A gift. Something to keep Claire's children company. Something small and alive and full of the particular energy that only a puppy carries. She had bought the food and the leash, and she had put the puppy in the car, and she had started driving, and then the road had turned, and the ice had not, and everything after that had happened in the 2 seconds it takes a car to leave a highway and begin to fall. Nathan called 911. Then he called Claire Hollis, whose number he found in the phone that was still in Margaret's coat pocket, its battery dead, its screen cracked into a constellation of broken glass. He charged it in his truck and made the call from the shoulder of the highway with Titan sitting at his feet, and the puppy wrapped in the wool blanket from behind his seat, shaking, pressing into his chest the way a creature presses into warmth when warmth has become the entire definition of survival. Claire arrived before the ambulance. She came around the curve at a speed that said she had been waiting for this call for 8 days and had stopped believing it would come. When she saw Nathan standing on the shoulder with the puppy in his arms and Titan at his side, she stopped the car in the middle of the road and got out and didn't speak for a long time. Then she said, "Is she alive?" "She's alive," Nathan said. "She's hypothermic, and she's been unconscious, and she needs to get to a hospital now, but she's alive." What Nathan did not say, what the paramedics would later confirm, was that Margaret Hollis had survived 8 days in a wrecked car at the bottom of a ravine in early November in Montana, because the puppy had lain across her lap for the first 3 days before he had worked himself through the broken rear window and stationed himself outside the door, and the small, constant warmth of his body against hers had kept her core temperature just high enough, just barely enough, to prevent the final slide into the kind of hypothermia from which elderly bodies do not return. The puppy had not known what he was doing. He had simply stayed, and staying had been enough. The story reached the Lincoln County Commission within a week. Claire Hollis filed a formal complaint against Sheriff Whitfield that included the dates of her calls, the dates they were not returned, the 48-hour search window, and the reclassification of her mother's case as a voluntary disappearance. The complaint was supported by Nathan's documentation of the scene, photographs of the tire marks on the highway shoulder that were clearly visible from the road, the broken reflector post that any deputy walking the shoulder would have seen, and the wreck itself, which sat less than 50 feet from the highway in terrain that a basic search protocol would have covered in the first 6 hours. The county commission opened an internal review. Dale Whitfield was placed on administrative leave. He retired 4 months later, before the review was completed, with a pension that the county council voted in a closed session to reduce by 30%. He did not attend the vote. He did not make a statement. He moved to a town in Idaho whose name nobody in Lincoln County bothered to learn. 5 months after the morning on Highway 93, Nathan Cole sat on the porch of his house outside Eureka with a cup of coffee that was still warm and a view of the north pasture that looked, for the first time since he'd bought the place, like it belonged to someone who intended to stay. The fence was finished. The barn roof no longer leaked. The quiet was the same quiet it had always been, but it had changed shape somehow. It was no longer the quiet of a man waiting for something to begin, but the quiet of a man who had stopped needing things to begin and had started letting them continue. Titan lay on the porch boards in a patch of November sun, his titanium tooth catching the light, his eyes half closed in the slow, measured blink of a dog who is determined that the perimeter is secure and has granted himself permission to rest. Beside him, wedged into the curve of Titan's belly with his head resting on Titan's front paw, a 5-month-old German Shepherd puppy slept with the absolute, boneless abandon of an animal who has decided that he is safe. Claire had asked Nathan to keep him. She had said that her mother wanted him to, that Margaret, from her hospital bed, had told Claire that the puppy belonged with the man who had come down the hill. Nathan had said he didn't need another dog. Titan had looked at the puppy, and then at Nathan, and had walked to the truck and waited. The matter was settled. The puppy's name was Scout, and he had already learned to follow Titan everywhere, including into sleep. Margaret Hollis spent 3 weeks in the hospital in Kalispell. She had frostbite on 4 fingers and both feet, a fractured collarbone, and 2 cracked ribs, and she would walk with a cane for the rest of her life, which her doctors told her was a remarkable thing to have, because by every reasonable measure she should not have had a rest of her life to walk through. She moved in with Claire in December. She did not drive again. On the first Saturday of every month, Claire drove her mother to Nathan's property, and Margaret sat in a chair on the porch and watched Scout chase Titan across the pasture with the tireless, joyful persistence of a puppy who has not yet learned that the world contains anything other than running. And Margaret would hold her coffee in hands that still ached from the cold, and she would say, "Every time that dog saved my life." She meant Scout. She also meant Titan. She did not make a distinction, and nobody corrected her. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a dog who will not leave, who does not understand the mathematics of survival or the biology of warmth or the reason why staying matters, but who stays anyway, because staying is the only language his heart was ever taught. God does not always send rescue on the first day, or the second, or even the 7th. Sometimes he sends it on the 8th, through a man driving home with lumber and a dog who lifted his head at the exact moment the road passed above a place where something small and faithful was still waiting. In our own lives, the people who need us most are not always visible from the road. Sometimes they are below the shoulder, past the tree line, in the places we would have to climb down to reach. The only question is whether we trust the ones beside us enough to follow them into the ravine. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that faithfulness, the quiet, stubborn, unreasonable kind, is still the most powerful force on earth. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us, has an animal ever stayed with you through something you couldn't have survived alone? Your story might be the one that reminds someone else to look a little closer at the side of the road. If you believe in stories of loyalty, courage, and the bonds that hold when everything else breaks, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next journey. May God bless you, protect your family, and remind you always, the ones who stay are the ones who save us. And you are never alone.